Okay, welcome to everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Gianluca Argentin, and I'm really pleased to introduce you Professor Rutkowski, who is our guest today, and she will deliver a keynote speech about the issue of technological innovations and international assessment. Leslie Rutkowski is an associate professor at the Indiana University. She is widely recognized as an expert in the field of international large-scale assessment. And if you have time, just have a look at their incredible curriculum vitae. She has a CV which is impressive, an amount of articles, chapters, and books, which is really overwhelming. And she also edited a handbook of international large-scale assessment. And she is not only associate editor for the Springer Journal of Large-Scale Assessments in Education, but also she's a chair at the PISA and the NAEP surveys. So I don't know how she handled all this and how she's at the same time able to teach at the Indiana University and as I discovered a few minutes ago, also at Oslo University. So I'm really glad to introduce you this brilliant colleague and really willing to listen her and their speech. Please, Leslie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the very, very nice introduction. It's very kind of you. Thank you all for coming today and for being willing to participate in this digital environment. I'm really sorry that we can't be together physically. It would be so nice to spend some time together in Italy. But since we can't, again, thank you for being willing to be digital with me. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and a short apology. I started off using the very nice INVALSI template, and then I realized it was causing some real trouble with my formatting. So I'm going to switch here in just a second. But I want to talk a little bit about international assessment, how it's grown, and some of the measurement challenges that are associated with it, and then something about technological innovations in international assessment, and whether we could think about them as being a savior, a curse, both, or neither. Again, thank you for the invitation. And now I'm going to make a switch to my university template because it was better for my formatting. I'm sorry. Okay, so just briefly a little bit about international assessment. I'm assuming based on the audience that you probably know all of this, so I will spend just a moment on this. I'm going to focus on the big three, and those being PISA, TIMSS, and PEARLS. And as you can see, they differ in that the cycles are different, 3 years, 4 years, and 5 years. They're also different in that the samples for which the inferences are drawn to the population are different. The content areas are different. And as you probably know, and if not, then you'll notice here, PISA tests a lot more domains on a single test, and they're also much more innovative in the other domains that they test. The tests are also sponsored by different organizations. The OECD sponsors PISA, the IEA sponsors TIMSS and PEARLS. And these numbers aren't quite accurate. PISA has grown substantially, and they will be over 80 participants in the 2022 cycle. Okay, so I'm going to focus on PISA because they're unique in a lot of ways. They're more innovative than the IEA studies tend to be. And they're also unique in that the structure of the organization that governs PISA is an economic organization. And this is in contrast to the IEA, which is fundamentally a research organization. PISA is administered by the OECD in 4 OECD countries. Although this is shifting somewhat, the test is designed for economically developed countries. And this means that results are generally only validated for OECD countries. So this raises a concern for non-OECD participants that if you participate in PISA, you need to validate the interpretations for your country. There's also been substantial growth in PISA since its beginning in 2000. As you can see, there were 34 OECD countries and 13 non-OECD participants. And this has changed over time with the OECD member countries growing slightly from 34 to 37 from 2000 to 2018. And the number of non-OECD participants has grown substantially from 13 in 2000 to 43 in 2018. It's quite popular. There are a lot of countries that would like to participate, and you can see that. You can also see that the GDP per capita is quite different between OECD participants and non-OECD participants. And this is in 2018 dollars, and you can see that there are quite substantial differences. So why does this matter when what it sounds like I'm talking about are macroeconomic issues? From a measurement perspective, when we have more than 80 educational systems with different languages, different cultures, geographies, and levels of economic development, and when we take into account the fact that within countries we have multiple language groups, we have many, many challenges to making sure that our measures are functioning the same way across countries. It also makes it extremely challenging to develop one single assessment that can reasonably measure all of these different groups. As one example, I'm showing the achievement distributions for PISA in 2015 in only the science domain. The dark curves on this plot are for countries or participants that were within plus or minus half a standard deviation of the OECD average. Those in lighter gray curves are participants that scored above or below the half a standard deviation of the OECD average. And what you'll notice here is that the left-hand side with the lighter gray curves, those are much more substantial than the light gray curves that we might see on the right-hand side of the plot. What we can glean from this is that low participation is becoming a dominant feature in PISA. Then in the next slide, I'm repeating the achievement distribution, and below that, I'm putting the items that are used to measure the assessment. So on the bottom plot, we see the item difficulty for the PISA science items. And a principle of item response theory, the models that are used to estimate achievement, has a principle that items and people can be placed on the same scale. So the proficiency or the ability of a student can be situated relative to the difficulty of an item. And what we would like to see on a good test is that examinees are well matched to the difficulty of the items. That means that students should be about as able as the test is difficult. And what we can see on the left-hand side of this plot is that where the low achievers lie, there are far fewer items. They're not as well matched. And it's hard to see at the aggregate when we're looking at all of these countries, but I have a couple of examples where we're looking at individual countries. So this is for two countries, the United States, and then I'll show you the Dominican Republic, which is the lowest achiever in 2015. You can just focus on the bottom two plots, and I'm going to turn on my annotation feature so that I can highlight what I'm interested in. This is the proficiency distribution or the achievement distribution for the United States. And in this bottom panel, we see items organized in order of difficulty and the probability of a correct response from left to right. On the far left part of the plot, these are the easiest items with the highest probability of a correct response. These at the right side are the most difficult items with the lowest probability of a correct response. Again, a well-matched test to the examinee sample is one where most of the items would sit under the center of the distribution. In the United States, we see that this is in fact the case, and that the PISA test does a good job of measuring the United States. We can contrast this to the Dominican Republic, where again, if we focus on the bottom two panels, you can see that the Dominican Republic's achievement distribution is shifted far down the scale to much lower levels of achievement. This has the consequence that they're measured by far fewer items. As you can see, the center of the distribution sits over very, very few items, meaning that this group of examinees are not well measured. An innovation in PISA recently is PISA for Development. Sorry, I have to move some of the, there we go, some of the Zoom features out of the way. So PISA for Development was developed for very low performing countries or economically developing countries, which tend to be low performing. And you can see here the list of the countries that participated, at least in the in-school assessment. And just to highlight, these countries are really quite different in comparison to typical PISA countries. Even the lowest performing Dominican Republic, these countries really start to look different in terms of economic development, culture, and political history, especially if you think about the case of Cambodia, Ecuador, Honduras, a lot of the Latin American countries, and the West African countries. In this case, measurement challenges really are, they go on. It was developed to measure very low performers, and it's a mix of PISA trend items and easy items from other assessments. And in spite of these developments, we still aren't quite there. So if we take a look at the same kinds of plots for PISA for Development, this is the distribution of all of the countries sitting on top of the item location or the item difficulty for our reading items, which there were 66 of those. And we can see that the proficiency distribution is shifted a little bit further down the scale than we would like if we were doing a great job of measuring these groups. If we just highlight a couple of countries, here we can see Paraguay, which is reasonably well measured based on where the distribution of proficiency is resting over the item difficulties. There are lots of items that are sitting underneath of the center of their distribution, and it isn't until we get out into the tails where we see that measurement is relatively thin. In contrast to Senegal, you see that Senegal has shifted down this achievement continuum, and there are relatively few or fewer items that are sitting underneath of their achievement distribution, suggesting that they're less well measured. Then again, taking Cambodia, we see that this center distribution is sitting on top of really relatively few items. Again, indicating that in spite of the fact that many of the items on this test are easier, they're still too difficult for the typical Cambodian student. So what about technology in international assessment? Can this help? Can it hurt? Maybe a bit of both. So the topic of computer-based assessment, all of the big three are either currently using computer-based assessment or they're transitioning to computer-based assessment. And this opens up a lot of new possibilities for test design and implementation. It also opens up new data sources. And I'm going to discuss two of these and also some related research. So first of all, I want to talk about multi-stage testing, which is an innovation that's unique to PISA. The IEA hasn't adopted this yet, so neither TIMSS nor PEARLS are using it. So what is it? For those of you that know something about measurement, maybe this is familiar. For those of you that don't, I'll just do a little bit of a primer on the topic. It means that it's adaptive, but it's not fully adaptive, like an item level computer adaptive test. So rather than a full computer adaptive test where the next item selection is based on performance on the previous item, multi-stage testing is built in modules. And this means that the next module that you take is based on performance on a previous module. And I'll say just a little bit more about this. So how does it work? And this is one of many possible designs. So here you can see that there are 6 modules, the first of which is what's called the core module. The others are of different difficulty. The top here is a moderately difficult stage. The bottom is a moderately easy module. Then we have 3 further modules, difficult, medium, and easy. So the way that this works is the examinee begins in the first module. Then based on some threshold, either number of items correct or another statistical criteria, there's a decision made about whether the student should be routed to a more difficult module or an easy module. If they've done very well, they'll be routed to a more difficult module. If they haven't done well, they'll be routed to an easier module. Then the process is repeated. We get an estimate of their proficiency level. If they're above a threshold, then we would route them to a more difficult module. If they're below the threshold, we would route them to an easier module. And then finally, their proficiency is estimated at the end. This is what's known in the computer adaptive testing literature as a 3-stage 1, 2, 3 design. There are a whole lot of others, and the PISA design doesn't look quite like this, but it's something similar. A bit more similar to the PISA design is that there are multiple panels. So you don't just have to have one panel. And because there are so many items on PISA, there needed to be multiple panels. And it's also good for controlling position effects, and it's also good for test security. Because the design linking between these panels is possible, meaning that we can get common estimates of achievement for everyone that participates. And these right arrows off to the side are showing the way in which the panels are linked. So for example, this top panel is linked to the second panel through the medium 1 cluster, the high 4 cluster, the medium 5 cluster, and the low 6 cluster or module. And then this process is repeated throughout, so everyone is linked. The clear advantages of multi-stage testing is that it improves efficiency. So this gives us the opportunity to make a shorter test than we would in a normal test and still achieve the same results from a statistical perspective. It also improves precision, which is great. One of the big things that multi-stage testing gives us in this environment, and if you think back to the Cambodian situation where the students, or even in the Dominican Republic, where the students are far down the scale, their chances of getting a correct answer are very, very low. So sitting through a test where you don't know the answer to any of the questions can be a very frustrating experience. The same if it's a very, very easy test and you know immediately all of the answers to the questions. It's not engaging, it's not interesting. And if you don't know anything, it's going to be frustrating. So this can improve the test taking experience as you can target the difficulty of the test to the examinee. Related, the tests can be tailored to needs of test taking populations. And this is where I see the possibility for real improvement and innovation in international assessment, is that items can be developed in a way that low performers such as Cambodia, such as the Dominican Republic and Senegal, can be better targeted. And so that we can know more about what they know and what they can do. But here's the rub. Many of the countries, because of the issues that differentially trouble less economically developed countries, are taking a paper-based version of PISA or PISA for development. Because in some places electricity is unstable, in some places electronics or the technology that we need to administer the test just doesn't exist in a reliable way, then they have to take it in a paper-based way, and so they're not going to get the advantages of a multi-stage test. If PISA-D countries, if these very low-performing, less economically developed countries do go toward a computer-based assessment, there are going to be some problems with this, which the OECD is currently addressing through the contractors at ETS. And this has to do with routing in MST. So like I said, if you're above some threshold, you're going to go to more difficult items. If you're below some threshold, you're going to go to easier items. But in this context, low performers or low performing countries are going to see the easy items more often. And high performers are going to see the hard items more often. This gives us a situation where it's not a representative sample of examinees that are seeing the test items, and this risks biasing item parameters. So what to do? ETS implemented a really sophisticated approach where they're intentionally misrouting students. So regardless of your performance, there are some students that are going to be routed to, let's say they were below the threshold, they're going to be routed to a harder block of items anyway, so that we can get a representative sample of students that are taking the test. But a question remains about how much of this should be done, how much is ideal, and does it fix the problem? We did a small simulation where we looked into this. And this first plot is a simulation with different kinds of routing. And what we're looking at is the ability to recover the item difficulty. So on the x-axis, we're looking at the generated or the simulation values of the item difficulty. And on the y-axis, we're looking at what we were able to estimate when we analyzed the data. A perfect situation is that all the data fall along the line. The three different panels correspond to three different conditions where we randomly assigned modules to students. This most closely aligns with the paper-based assessments where we have a matrix sample design and students randomly get a booklet that has a particular kind of structure. The middle panel corresponds to a situation where the students are strictly routed based on their achievement. So if they're above the threshold, they go to a harder block of items. If they're below the threshold, they go to an easier block of items. On the right-hand side, probabilistic misrouting is what we call this. This is where a certain percentage of students are intentionally misrouted regardless of their performance. This plot isn't so interesting because what we see is that we're doing a good job of recovering the difficulty parameters regardless of how the students are routed. But if we take a look at discrimination, we see a slightly different story. And in particular, with merit routing, we see that there's a bit more noise in our ability to recover these parameters. And it's not perfect. But once we introduce a bit of misrouting, and in this case, we misrouted 20% of examinees regardless, we can see that we do a really good job of recovering their discrimination parameters. The parameter in the item response model that gives us an indication of how well the item is able to discriminate among low performers and high performers. So we're able to recover that parameter about as well as we are when we just randomly assign the parameter to the items to the student or the modules to the student. So this suggests that from a simulation perspective or from an experimental perspective, we're doing a good job if we use this kind of misrouting. Another criteria for determining whether or not it worked well is if we can recover the achievement of the population that we use to generate the data. And here we have three different groups of countries. We have high-performing countries, we have medium-performing countries, and we have low-performing countries. Again, these are all simulated countries. So this is group 1, group 2, group 3, and then we see we have 3 box plots within. And these correspond to those different routing mechanisms. On the left-hand side, we have random assignment. In the middle, we have based just only on merit, how they did on the assessment. And then the last panel is, or the last box plot is probabilistic misrouting. It may be hard to see, but there's also a little gray triangle that represents the true value of proficiency. In high-performing countries, it really doesn't matter how we route them. We're able to recover their achievement really well. In medium-performing countries, the story is pretty similar. But you start to see that in low-performing countries, if we only use merit routing, this middle panel, this gray triangle starts to fall off of the median of the box plot. Same for this next lowest performing country. And then finally, our very lowest performing country is a bit off. But again, with probabilistic misrouting, we see that we're able to recover things pretty well. So this idea of intentionally misrouting students into items that don't exactly match their proficiency is one that produces good statistical results. So the next issue I wanted to talk about is around item development. Because of the speed with which multi-stage testing was adopted, and because of the condensed cycle of a study like PISA, there was no time to be able to specifically develop items for a multi-stage testing context, which is a really important part of test development. So items that had already been developed were used, especially trend items, but also items that were developed for the next cycle were used. But I would argue that although it's expensive to develop new items, if we want to take full advantage of the multi-stage test context, we really need to be able to develop items that are specific for that so that we can catch these very low performing countries and that we can do a better job of measuring them. It's important for test examinee mismatch, which I showed you before, but it's also important from a probability perspective. So if you just take an average PISA item, one that's at the originally scaled average of 500 on the PISA scale, and you take a typical student from each one of these countries, and by typical, I mean at the center of their achievement distribution, and you calculate the probability of a correct answer for each of these students, you can see there's a lot of variability. And this is from PISA 2015 Science. In the Dominican Republic, a typical student in the Dominican Republic to a typical PISA item has only a 6% chance of answering that question correctly, all the way up to a 72% chance in Finland. Now, this is really striking in these very low performing countries because this is a multiple choice item, meaning that if they just rolled a 4-sided die, they would have a 1 in 4 chance of getting the right answer. So in these countries, their probability of a correct answer is much lower than chance. So we thought, well, what would actually have to change about a test to be able to do a better job, particularly from a recovery standpoint, and to be able to recover their achievement in a good way? Years ago, PISA had a design where they had easy booklets. So there were blocks of easier items that were administered to countries that were either low performing historically or were expected to be low performing based on other factors. So we looked at how many easy booklets would you need to be able to recover proficiency in low performing countries. And what we found through our simulation is that we would need a lot of very easy items to improve matters. And I'll show you what I mean. So what we see is the results of a simulation. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into all the details. But what we see here is that so on the x-axis is the number of easy clusters, and on the y-axis is the bias. So it's just the difference between what we generated and what we estimated. This dashed line here is 0 bias, and that's ideal. And what we see here are plots of results of bias for each one of our different conditions. The diamond that we see here is one where there are no easy clusters. And then each one of the different shapes corresponds to easy cluster difficulty of a different magnitude. So we start by adding one easy cluster that has an average difficulty of -1.89, all the way up to an easy cluster of -1.689. And then we continue to add easy clusters as we go and look at how that changes the bias in our ability to recover proficiency. We can see that bias is worse when there are no easy clusters, and that as we add easy clusters, the bias goes down. But this is where we have items that are a little bit easier. And it's not until we have items that are a lot easier and a lot of them that we're able to fully get rid of the bias. Now, this bias isn't huge, granted, but it's there, and that's a problem. And these are we use typical PISA countries in this, typical OECD PISA countries in this, not OECD, but typical PISA countries. So as other sorts of countries come on board, and as their economic development and achievement starts to drift further and further away from the OECD average, we would expect that this is not going to improve. Okay, the last thing I just wanted to talk about is process data. And this is a side effect of computer-based assessment. It wasn't designed to be this way. There's no framework guiding it, but it's something that happens when we have a computer-based assessment. And so I think about it, and a lot of people think about it as sort of spillover or ancillary or side effect data from a computer-based assessment. So what is it? Well, it's the amount of time that a student spends on an item, and also the amount of time that they spend on the total test. It's the number of mouse clicks or the number of actions that they take to answer a question. There's also a lot of other information, but the number of actions and the amount of time they spend is something that's published as part of the PISA database, and also now with the IEA database. There are a lot of questions, and I spend a lot of my time thinking about this from a validity perspective. What can we do with this data? What should we do with this data? And what sort of validity evidence do we need to make claims about results that come from using this data? And why would we care? Well, like I said, there's so much of it. It's the same as when we go on Facebook or Twitter. You know, our data is constantly being collected, the way in which we interact, the number of likes, what we like, what we don't like, what we read, what we don't read, all of that stuff is collected. And the same is true in the international assessment arena, but the inferences that are made and the consequences that are made with these results are a little bit different. So, like I said, there aren't any frameworks that guide what should be collected. There aren't any guidelines about what should be collected or how it should be used or what limits should be placed on it. And this is where I think that a lot of work needs to be done. One of the issues that we see are that there are big cross-cultural differences in the way in which students engage with online tests, or I'm sorry, computer-based tests. And what I have here is a survival model where we're looking at quitting behavior between 3 different countries. The first is the Dominican Republic, the United States, and Singapore. So what we see on the x-axis is the number of seconds that a student was partaking in the test. And then what we see on the y-axis is the probability of quitting. So the curves all start off at 1, and over time, students begin to quit the test. And the way that we counted quitting was they either began to engage in rapid guessing, or they did not see the questions that followed some point. So we can see that in the Dominican Republic, students quit very early and very dramatically. The United States has a different curve. They hang in a little bit longer, but at some point they also, and this starts to become a matter of small sample size, this really dramatic drop off. But you see that they do also engage in quitting behavior, but they never reach what's called the estimated lifetime. So the point at which about half of respondents have quit, or they do so at a point where it's a very, very small number of examinees that are left taking the test. By contrast, and maybe not surprising based on what we know about East Asian culture and also performance on PISA, the Singapore students, they have a very, very low probability of quitting the test, and it really doesn't change much over time. They really persevere until the end. But what I want to highlight here is that there are these big cross-cultural differences, and it's hard to infer just by looking at the timing what's actually going on with an examinee, what sorts of test-taking behavior they're engaging with. Are they actually engaged? I mean, we know when we look at rapid guessing, if a student looks at a test for 2 seconds and or looks at a question for 2 seconds and then moves on, we know that they're not actually engaged. We have a good idea that they're not actually engaged, whether or not they respond and even maybe guess correctly. The OECD currently uses timing data, and they use it as deciles of time to enter into the conditioning model. So this raises some questions. Should they? I mean, basically, this is a big multiple imputation model. And if you know a little bit about multiple imputation, you know that you should put into the model what you plan to actually use later on. And you should also put stuff into the model that explains missingness. So we know that the amount of time a student spends correlates with achievement. So maybe it should be included. And it's also the case that the conditioning model is specific to each country. So an argument that, well, there are cross-cultural differences and the way that students engage in the Dominican Republic is going to be very different than the way that they engage in Italy or Germany or South Africa. But what if there are different test-taking strategies within countries? And we could imagine that in big heterogeneous countries that would be the case. The one point that I've been thinking a lot about lately, and one that I think is a pretty easy thing to fix, is that students don't know that these data are being collected. They know that they're participating in a test. They know that their answers to the questions are being recorded. They also know that their answers to the background questions are being recorded. But they don't realize that the amount of time that they spend is being recorded, and they don't realize that the number of actions or any of the other process data, any of this other log file data are being recorded. And I think that's something that should be communicated to the students. It's a violation of APA, NCME, and AERA standards to not communicate the ways in which data are being used that are collected about a test taker. Now, I know that these are US standards and that they're not international, but then this raises my next point. I think we need international test standards. And this is kind of my recent hobby horse, and I really hope that we can put some resources behind that, and I'm doing what I can to move that forward, to start to develop some international test standards. There also needs to be more validation research on the way in which timing data can and should be used, how things differ across countries, the ways in which examinees engage differently. And there needs to be much more measurement or methodological research on this topic so that we can understand a lot more about it. We need to spend as much time dealing with process data as we do with item response data so that we can get a better handle on it. And we need smaller scale research studies that are somewhat qualitative in nature, where we're doing think aloud protocols so that we can understand what's going on with students' processes and the ways in which they're engaging. And I just wanted to thank a recently concluded grant from the Norwegian Research Council for funding much of this research. And I also wanted to thank you for your patience and for participating in this session. And I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Leslie. It was really interesting, and thank you for being able to be so clear in explaining so technical issues, and at the same time in being able to show the general picture and the specific points related to that picture. It was really interesting for me. So please, questions. I would like, if someone has questions, to just write them in the chat, or if you prefer, just write in the chat that you want to express your question opening your microphone. Okay, Daniele brought a question. I can remove this. Daniele brought more and more, sorry, they asked me, Leslie, if you can remove your screen sharing. More and more Italy is engaging in CBA, writes Daniele Vidoni, for the annual national large scale assessment. And he asks, in terms of effort required on item development, what is the difference between CAT and MSAT?
That's a big question.
Daniele always asks big questions. He's a friend.
Okay. I think so. I would say that there are two parts of this. One part is if you're looking at item level. Hi, Daniela, I can see your face. Nice to see you. One issue is when you're dealing with item level CAT, and typically in situations where a CAT is implemented, you have a huge pool of items. And the discrimination of that item needs to be pretty high because that's what's used to decide what item comes next. So the specifics around individual items needs to be much more fine-tuned than it is in an MST situation, at least for that sort of purpose, especially, and this will take me to my next response, is around the stakes of the assessment. If you're making decisions about whether someone should be admitted into, say, law school, then you're gonna have to spend a lot more time with item development and also item security. So when security is a big deal, you're gonna need a really huge pool of items that have been well validated and that have really good psychometric properties. And also speaking about psychometric properties, if you have, say, a criterion reference test where they have to be above a threshold to be able to get into, say, law school or don't get into, say, law school, then you need to really target the items right around that threshold, and they need to be really discriminating right around that threshold. So again, it's partly due to stakes and also partly how well you really need that test to function so that you can make good decisions. With MST, one of the issues around like PISA and the ways in which we're a little bit limited is that the item parameters don't even actually get estimated until data collection. So this idea of having a big giant item bank where we know what the item parameters are, that's a little bit outside of the possibility given the nature of the way PISA is developed and the way it's implemented. I hope that answers your question.
Christina Stringer asks if you can say something more about international standards for testing.
Sure. And I was just looking on my shelf. I'm actually in my office for the first time in 1 year. And the reason I'm in my office is because we're getting a new furnace installed in our house and we have no heat, and it's also very, very noisy. And I think I moved all of my books home. but there are APA, NCME, AERA standards around the way in which tests should be developed and the way in which data should be collected, the way in which results can be reported, and around the way in which things should be communicated to test takers. So from an international standpoint, I think a lot of the cross-cultural, like those serve as a great basis. And I think those could be used as a sort of template for how we might develop international test standards. But I think additionally, we need to think about these cross-cultural dimensions, which we don't think about as much. And I mean, as big and diverse as the United States is, we don't really take into account that, that we're testing in many different languages. So translation should be one part of the standards. And PISA has technical standards that they adhere to. And they also have other standards for translation and things that they adhere to. But I think this needs to be done at an international level that the measurement and assessment community can all get behind and feel like, yes, we agree that these are the standards that we should adhere to in an assessment setting. So the cross-cultural measurement issues around translation, item development, those all need to be taken into account. Issues around like cultural appropriateness. I mean, this is done to a certain degree, but I think it needs to be written down in internationally agreed upon standards.
Thank you, Leslie. And another question coming from Ottavio Rizzo. He asked if you can adapt these techniques to national standardized tests as our national one in order to take into account the different level of ability among schools.
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think one time my husband and I bought a house that needed some work, and we were a little bit worried about the structure of the house and if it was gonna keep standing up, and also the problems that existed if we were able to fix them. And we talked to an engineer and he said, anything is fixable. It's just the pain is in the price. And I think anything can be a computerized adaptive test. It's just the pain is in the price. Are you willing to spend the money that you need to make a good psychometrically appropriate test for the population and for the level of inferences and for the stakes that you want to put on the test?
Thank you very much for sharing also your personal experience. I have a question too, if you don't mind. I think we have some few minutes more if other questions come. I was thinking about, people who are skeptical or critics towards testing and toward PISA in particular, and who question the validity of all your effort. In my opinion, all you showed us today is clearly a huge effort to preserve validity and inclusion and to keep heterogeneity into the discourse. And so I really appreciate it. On the same time, I'm worried about how you can avoid that all this effort translates into easy, easy manageable critics coming from people questioning the validity of PISA. I mean, the farther you go from just a booklet, the same booklet delivered everywhere, the more exotic it becomes and the more easy it is for people criticizing this kind of assessment to manipulate what you are doing and tell a story that is not what you are really doing.
So let's see, I want to think about how I want to say this. I mean, I'm definitely critical of aspects of PISA, and I've been an open critic about that for years. But I think by and large, the test itself and the psychometricians that are working on this test are doing a really good job, and they're doing the best job that they can under the constraints of like a 3-year cycle, which, I mean, it's such a challenge. By the time they're working on reporting results of cycle X, they're already piloting and moving into the field trial for cycle X+1. I mean, it's really like, I think people probably feel a little bit like a mailman, like the mail just never stops coming. And so I think under the circumstances, the contractors are doing an excellent job. I mean, yes, there's work that needs to be done. And I think a lot of this comes in from the political sphere. I'm not convinced that every country should take part in PISA. I don't think, I mean, as I showed empirically, it's not an appropriate test for everyone. And the pain is in the price to make that test appropriate for everyone. And I think a lot of work would have to be done for us to say that, yeah, everyone can participate and everyone will be well measured and you can make valid inferences. I think, you know, there are definitely a group of researchers that think that like the people that run PISA might also eat babies on the side. I'm definitely not in this camp, and I think that's a pretty radical perspective. I mean, of course, there are problems. Every study, every empirical study is going to suffer from problems, but I think like these really radical viewpoints on it, I find that they come from folks that aren't fully understanding the details, or maybe they understand just enough to be dangerous.
Exactly the point, exactly the point. Okay, thank you very much. They write me that we need to close in order to allow other sessions to go on. It was really, really, really interesting. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that you cannot make you the applause, but I hope you feel our gratitude for your intervention. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure, Leslie.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation. Thanks to Magda and Daniela and everyone. I can't see everyone's faces, but I really want to thank you all. I enjoyed this very much, and I hope that we can do it again and that we can do it in person.
For sure. Thank you very much again.
Yes.
Goodbye. Thank you.